Ken Curtis, forever remembered as the lovable, rough-around-the-edge Festus Hagen on Gunsmoke, lived a life far deeper, more complicated, and more surprising than anyone watching their TV screens ever imagined. For years, fans believed they knew everything about the man behind one of television's most iconic Western characters. But long after the camera stopped rolling, and long after Gunsmoke itself faded into legend, Ken Curtis finally revealed a truth he had kept tucked away from the world, a truth he admitted only much later in life, a truth that shocked even the people who worked with him for decades. It wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about conflict. And it certainly wasn't the kind of Hollywood gossip people expect. Instead, it was something far more human, something emotional, vulnerable, and deeply personal. Something he spent years trying to hide behind that hilarious grin, that scratchy voice, and his unforgettable banter with Marshall Matt Dillon. Ken Curtis had always seemed unstoppable, a singer with a golden voice, a Western star with a loyal fan base, and a man who blended humor with grit in a way no one else ever could. But behind the scenes, he was quietly wrestling with fears he thought would destroy his career if anyone ever found out. And when he finally opened up, it changed the entire way fans and colleagues remembered him. Today, we're diving into the real story, the emotional journey, the private battles, and yes, the ugly truth Ken Curtis finally confessed years later. For most fans, Ken Curtis was the very definition of effortless talent. When he burst onto the screen as Festus Hagen, his performance felt so natural, so lived in, that audiences simply assumed he was the character, a scruffy, unpredictable, sharp-tongued deputy with a heart of gold and a stubborn streak a mile wide. But what viewers didn't know, what even his closest colleagues misunderstood for years, was how calculated, rehearsed, and emotionally demanding that role truly was for him. Curtis came into Gunsmoke with an unusual background for a Western actor. Before ever picking up a six-shooter on screen, he had been a professional singer with the Sons of the Pioneers, blessed with a smooth, operatic baritone that stunned anyone who heard him. The man who would later become known for his gravelly Festus drawl had once been hailed for possessing one of the cleanest voices in Western music. And that contrast between who he was and who he pretended to be became the foundation of the ugly truth he later admitted. From the moment he joined Gunsmoke, Curtis knew Festus would only work if he committed to the voice, the posture, the walk, and the personality with absolute, unwavering conviction. What he didn't expect was how deeply that transformation would eat away at him. The voice he created, raspy, high-pitched, and distinctly unpolished, was not just an acting choice. It was a mask, a shield, a way of hiding the fear that he didn't fit the rugged image of a Western gunslinger. Because privately, Curtis struggled with something almost no one knew. He never believed he was rugged enough, tough enough, or intimidating enough for the role. With his musical background, his clean-cut appearance, and his soft-spoken, real-life personality, he feared audiences would reject him as just another polished Hollywood performer pretending to be a cowboy. And that fear pushed him to overcompensate, pouring everything he had into building Festus from the ground up. The transformation was astonishing. The slumped shoulders, the sideways gait, the half-mumbled insults, the comedic timing, the deep emotional sincerity was all a crafted performance, one he worked on relentlessly off-camera. But the cost of that effort was something he never discussed until many years later. Friends often noticed the exhaustion behind his smile, the way he stayed in character even after long days of shooting, and the way he deflected compliments about his natural talent. Curtis wasn't confident. He was terrified that one wrong move would expose him as an imposter. Co-star James Arness, who played Matt Dillon, would sometimes try to get Curtis to relax, telling him he had nothing to prove. But Curtis couldn't shake the pressure he felt, not just from the role, but from Hollywood itself. In an industry obsessed with looks, masculinity, and typecasting, he believed there was no room for vulnerability. So he buried his insecurities deep inside and hid them behind Festus's humor and bravado. This internal battle continued for years. Every new episode brought the same anxiety. Will they still like me? Will the performance hold up? Will people see the real me underneath? What the audience perceived as effortless charm was, behind the scenes, the result of endless self-doubt and an unspoken fear of failure. And it wasn't until decades later, long after the show ended, long after Festus became a cultural icon, that Curtis finally admitted the truth. He had spent years hiding behind the character because he didn't believe the real Ken Curtis was good enough. This confession shocked fans, not because it tarnished his legacy, but because it revealed the quiet, emotional weight behind one of television's most beloved roles. When Ken Curtis finally opened up about his years on Gunsmoke, he revealed that the pressure he carried didn't come only from his own perfectionism, also came from circumstances on the set that fans never knew about. The chemistry between Curtis and the rest of the cast looked effortless on screen. But behind the scenes, things were far more complicated than anyone realized. And it was here that Curtis confessed an especially painful truth. He often felt like an outsider among a group of actors who had already built a tight-knit family long before he arrived. When Gunsmoke first launched in 1955, James Arness, Amanda Blake, Milburn Stone, and Dennis Weaver had already developed a rhythm, a shared sense of timing, and a deep mutual trust. By the time Curtis joined the cast nearly a decade later, this bond had become almost unbreakable. Curtis admired them tremendously, but he couldn't help feeling like the new kid who had to earn his place. And because Festus was replacing a character fans already loved, Weaver's Chester Curtis understood the stakes were even higher in private moments. Curtis admitted that the early years were incredibly nerve-wracking. He worried constantly about being compared to Weaver. Chester had been charming, loyal, clumsy, and lovable traits viewers had grown deeply attached to. The network received endless letters from fans complaining that Chester was gone, that Festus was too wild, too rough, too strange. Even though the criticism eventually faded, Curtis never forgot those first months of backlash. For a man who already struggled with self-confidence, it cut deeply. The dynamic on set didn't help his fears. The original cast members were kind to him, but they were also protective of the show's established tone. Arness was known to be quiet and reserved, often keeping to himself between takes. Milburn Stone, who played Doc, had a dry sense of humor and didn't easily open up to new people. Blake was warm but guarded. Curtis would later confess that he often felt like he was trespassing on someone else's land, even when everyone treated him professionally. But what made his anxiety far worse was the accidental creation of Festus's signature voice. Curtis worried the others thought he was overacting, pushing too far, or trying too hard to stand out. He once said that he feared becoming the comic relief who didn't belong, a tag that would destroy any hope of being taken seriously. To make matters worse, the workload was intense. Long hours, long shooting days, rewrites, reshoots, and pressure from the network to keep ratings high created an environment where tempers occasionally flared. Curtis, already struggling to feel secure, often interpreted normal production stress as signs he wasn't measuring up. A passing comment from a director, a tired sigh from another actor, or a lukewarm reaction to a scene could haunt him for days. Still, despite feeling out of place, Curtis never let his insecurity bleed into his work. In fact, it drove him to work harder. He spent nights rehearsing Festus's speech patterns, walking in front of mirrors to perfect the character's odd gait, and studying how his co-stars delivered their lines so he could match their rhythm. He was determined not just to fit in, but to earn his spot on that screen. What he didn't know was that while he struggled silently, the cast had begun to truly appreciate him. Stone grew fond of Festus's mischievous charm. Blake loved how Curtis brought warmth to even the roughest scenes. And Arness valued how dependable Curtis was, always showing up fully prepared and never causing production delays. Over time, they welcomed him not as a replacement for Chester, but as a completely irreplaceable part of the Gunsmoke family. But Curtis only learned this years later, and not from his co-stars directly. Instead, he discovered it through letters, interviews, and fan interactions long after the show ended. And that delayed realization, that he had been loved and respected all along, was part of the truth he wished he had understood sooner. As the years rolled on, Ken Curtis became one of the most recognizable faces on television, but privately. He struggled with another truth he wouldn't openly admit until much later: the character of Festus, as beloved as he was, created a strange kind of trap. Curtis had spent years carefully building the role, crafting every vocal inflection and physical quirk. The audience loved Festus so deeply that the character became inseparable from the man who played him. And while that level of fame sounds like a blessing, Curtis confessed that it eventually became one of the most painful burdens of his career. By the mid-1960s, Curtis had become Gunsmoke's secret weapon. Festus wasn't just comic relief, he added heart, unpredictability, warmth, and tension. Anytime the show needed something lighter or more sentimental, Festus could deliver. But over time, Curtis noticed something troubling. Hollywood no longer saw him as Ken Curtis, the versatile actor, the accomplished singer, or the dramatic performer. They saw only Festus. Casting directors would meet with him, smile politely, and then say things like, "We love you, but we can't picture you as anything else." For a man with a musical background as rich as his, this was emotionally devastating. Before Gunsmoke, Curtis sang in front of packed venues. His voice had earned the admiration of Roy Rogers, Bob Nolan, and countless Western music fans. He recorded albums, toured the country, and even led his own orchestra. But after years of playing Festus, that beautiful voice, once his proudest talent, became almost forgotten. Buried beneath the gravelly rasp he created for the show, Curtis confessed that he felt as if he had traded his identity for a role that consumed everything else. He said the worst part wasn't being typecasted, was that he couldn't escape the character even when he wasn't working. Fans would stop him in public and ask him to talk like Festus. Interviewers wanted stories about his scruffy character, not about his singing or his early films. Even friends joked about how they couldn't see the real Ken anymore. This wasn't malicious, but to Curtis, it was heartbreaking. It felt like the industry and, even the audience he loved, had forgotten who he truly was. Another part of the ugly truth was how physically demanding the role had become. That hunched walk, the twisted posture, the uneven gait. Curtis performed all of it naturally, with no prosthetics or assistance. But years of bending his body in unnatural ways took a painful toll. He developed back problems, stiffness, and long-lasting muscle tension. His doctors warned him repeatedly that the posture was doing real damage, but Curtis felt he had no choice. Festus was too important to viewers, and the show depended on him. Yet the physical pain wasn't the most difficult part. What cut deepest was the quiet loneliness he felt as the character's shadow grew ever larger. While his co-stars formed deep friendships off-camera, Curtis often retreated into his own world. He didn't want them to see how much he was struggling, how much pressure he felt to keep Festus alive, or how afraid he was of disappointing the millions of fans who tuned in each week. It reached a point where Curtis stopped pursuing other artistic opportunities altogether. He turned down roles in musicals, passed on singing engagements, and rarely performed live outside the occasional Western event. When friends asked why he didn't return to his musical roots, Curtis would laugh it off, saying he was too busy. But years later, he admitted the truth. He no longer believed anyone wanted to hear Ken Curtis sing. They only wanted Festus to talk. His confession revealed the core of his heart. Break the world loved Festus. But it no longer seemed to have room for Ken. Still, Curtis remained grateful. He never blamed fans, his co-stars, or the show. Instead, he blamed the industry's narrow vision and his own fear of stepping outside the role. And as he grew older, he wished more than anything that he had believed in his own talent enough to keep pursuing all that he was capable of, not just the part the world saw on TV in the final years of his life. Ken Curtis began speaking more openly about the emotional weight he had carried throughout his career. And it was during this time that he revealed the part of the truth most people were never prepared to hear. Behind the humor, behind the cowboy grit, and behind the iconic charm of Festus Hagen was a man who spent decades quietly wrestling with regret over opportunities lost, relationships strained, and a career path that felt both blessed and bittersweet. Curtis often said that Gunsmoke was the greatest professional gift he ever received. But he also admitted that it had unintentionally stolen something from him: the chance to fully explore the range of talent he knew he possessed. There were roles he turned down, films he never auditioned for, and musical projects he abandoned because he feared stepping away from Festus would be seen as a betrayal to the audience that adored him. Every time he tried to envision a future beyond Dodge City, the pressure of fan expectations pulled him back. What few people realized was that this emotional tug-of-war seeped into his personal life as well. Curtis's dedication to his work, combined with the long hours and relentless filming schedule, created tension at home. Friends later shared that Curtis often struggled to balance the demands of stardom with the quieter, simpler life he wanted. He longed for time with loved ones, for a return to singing, for opportunities to explore other artistic passions. Yet he constantly felt obligated to remain the Festus the world expected. His confession revealed a painful irony. The success he achieved through Gunsmoke also created the loneliness he worked so hard to hide. Many fans assumed that someone with Curtis's charisma, talent, and fame must have enjoyed endless admiration and companionship. But Curtis admitted that playing such a distinctive character isolated him more than anyone knew. When people approached him, they weren't looking for Ken, they were looking for Festus. And while Curtis appreciated the love, he sometimes felt unseen, as though his true self was fading into the background as age began to catch up with him. Curtis also struggled with the lasting physical effects of embodying Festus. That famous crooked walk, the slouch, the unusual footwork, these were acting choices he committed to with unwavering discipline. But by the time he neared retirement, his body bore the consequences. He dealt with chronic stiffness, back discomfort, and mobility issues that were made worse by years of contorting his posture. He admitted that while he never regretted giving everything he had to the role, he sometimes wished he had taken better care of his health along the way. Yet, even with the sorrow and regret he revealed, Curtis also shared something profoundly moving: his immense gratitude for the fans who kept Festus alive in their hearts long after Gunsmoke ended. It was their letters, their stories, their shared memories that helped him finally understand that he had never truly been an outsider. The love he feared losing had been there all along. He just hadn't allowed himself to believe it when he was younger. In one of his later interviews, Curtis spoke about the ugly truth with a clarity that struck everyone who heard it. He said that he spent too many years hiding behind Festus, convinced he was never good enough. But in the end, he realized the opposite was true. The character's success was born from the sincerity, vulnerability, and heart he poured into the role. Festus wasn't a mask. He was a reflection of the very best parts of Ken Curtis. And that revelation, though heartbreaking, also brought him peace. Fans remember Festus Hagen because he was funny, flawed, brave, loyal, and deeply human. But the man who played him was all of those things and more. Ken Curtis's final confession didn't diminish his legacy, illuminated it, showing us a man who gave everything he had to bring joy to millions, even while struggling silently with self-doubt. And years later, when people speak of him, it isn't just Festus they remember. It's Ken, the humble, gentle soul who left behind a legacy far richer and more emotional than anyone ever realized.